Welcome to Trending in Education. This is Mike Palmer. Today I'm joined by Charles Fadel, who is the founder of a nonprofit Center for Curriculum Redesign. He founded it back in 2012. He's a global education thought leader, futurist, author, and inventor. He's written a book, Education for the Age of AI, that we'll be talking about. Taught at numerous prestigious schools, worked in a bunch of amazing fields, including as the founder of Neurodyne AI, expert in artificial intelligence, how it intersects with learning. We'll talk about education engineering. We may even touch on his patents. Charles, you got a lot going on. Welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you, Mike. It's totally a pleasure.
We always start by letting our guests share their origin story in their own words. Can you catch us up on how you got to this point in your professional life?
Well, certainly very quickly, I studied electrical engineering and quantum physics, and then came to the US. So that was in France, came to the US for an MBA, and have always been interested in neuroscience and statistics and things of that nature. Started working in semiconductor companies, microchips, business development roles typically, and then migrated from semiconductors to systems at Cisco. And there transitioned from technology technology to education policy.
Hmm.
And when I left Cisco, I started this nonprofit because, there's only so much fun you can have pushing more bits faster. This is much more of a sense of purpose, helping humans improve their roles.
Yeah. And it's the Center for Curriculum Redesign. Can you talk a little more about the purpose of the organization?
Well, certainly the tagline we use is making education more relevant. There's a cry for relevance everywhere. How do I apply this in real life? The right balance between theoretical and practical, the right balance between psychological, social, and economic needs.
Mhm.
Just look around and you see all the complexities of the world that we have to navigate. And so this is about really education, a new generation of leaders, of change agents who are capable of handling this complexity.
Mhm. Yeah, and then there are frameworks which are central to the book, and then the book is Education for the Age of AI. So you're someone who started the center back in 2012, been grappling with some of these issues really over the past 10 plus years coming out of the pandemic, and then now since, November 2022, we've been in this new age of AI. Education for the Age of AI is your book. Can you describe what really led you to write the book and what the book's about?
Well, certainly because of my background, I knew this technology was about to become more mature. When I started Neurodyne, that was pretty much 30 years ago, we could compute only 3 layers of artificial neurons.
Hmm.
And so if you fast forward 30 years, now we have 100 million fold more processing power, which allows us also in terms of density to have enormous databases because memory cost has dropped so much. And so all of a sudden, these algorithms that were really not particularly useful have become incredibly useful.
And by the way, just jumping in, this is where people talk about compute and how compute
Exactly.
power, it's a buzzword that's out there, but it really does tie directly to Moore's law and some of the stuff you're describing here, where these transistors, these semiconductors, which you have a deep history in, they're accelerating to the point where things that were previously theoretical, hypothetical, now are actually in the field and being widely adopted.
That's exactly it, Mike. And to give you an idea of how long it takes for some of these things to mature, not only did we have the microchips, the semiconductors started in the 1920s and then 50s and so on, integrated circuits after that, but also, for example, Markov in 1895, writing about conditional probability, which is now a type of algorithm
Right.
used in machine learning. Then you also had Claude Shannon in 1945 writing about information theory and computing by hand
Hmm.
how, after several iterations, you could go from probability of having two letters follow each other, two diagrams, syllables, if you want to
Yep.
follow
Yep.
each other, to words following each other. And he showed over a few iterations how you started making, semi gibberish English, but you multiply that, a million fold
Yeah.
and I have real text.
That's going all the way back to Ada Lovelace, even in my head, where, some of those lattices that folks were talking about back in the day, how like, mechanization began, then that
Exactly.
became, computerization. And now we have so much compute power that these language generators, these language transformers are becoming agent level entities that we're trying to understand better. And then how does that all intersect with education, particularly K-12 education,
Yeah.
is really where your focus is.
Exactly. Exactly. And so perhaps as a preamble to why this matters to education, there are a couple of things I would like to discuss. The first one is being a little bit more dismissive about AI eats up the world and, general intelligence.
The
So
hype
let's
cycle meets the Terminator. Yes.
exactly enough with the hype cycle. We've gone through its cycle. Good enough. Let's move on. So AGI, not anytime soon, perhaps not in my lifetime,
Hmm.
although, and for very solid reasons. Technology is moved in a step function sort of way, so we're talking about sort of concepts that were developed in the 60s and 70s that are now reaching maturity. And along the way, you have phases of acceleration and then plateauing.
Hmm.
Look at GPT. There's no GPT-5. We
Right.
have GPT Omni after 14 months of waiting.
Right.
So in my mind, this is sign of saturation, of plateauing
Hmm.
with this type of algorithm and this type of capability. So Omni is going sideways, if you will,
Hmm.
rather than improving on the raw results, going sideways with multimodality.
Yeah. And the most interesting thing to me about it was the business model, the fact they went back to free with Omni. That
Right.
that is interesting because there's a lot of I've been having a lot of conversations about equity as it pertains to artificial intelligence. And if the premium versions are all behind a $20 a month paywall,
Yeah.
how do you make that accessible? How do you make sure that, it's more readily available? At least the early indications are that Omni is perhaps a move in the other direction from OpenAI. We'll see where that goes.
Well, they will need to monetize it one way or another.
Right.
It's not simply too heavy to continue free, but it could be free with ads. And I do.
Right. Cory Doctorow talks about enshittification, where like the advertising model kind of craps up things that launch actually in a better place, and then you also are pushed towards paying for something that kind of allows you to protect your attention, as opposed to the free versions are more
Exactly.
junked up with ad content. The equivalent of I've been thinking about how AI chatbots in some ways might resemble pop-up ads.
Yeah.
In some ways, there's an element of them that this is what I call Clippy's revenge, where I feel like the help bots are back. Some of them are better, but some of them are just kind of like, annoying, and you almost kinda wanna be able to focus without the distraction of an external
Exactly.
agent.
Exactly. Attention is at a premium.
Yeah.
So we dispatched AGI as being an immediate concern or even a reasonably long-term concern.
Mhm.
That means that no matter what, we're going to have to work for a living for the next, decades,
Right.
which means the jobs are not going to disappear. And so that means that education still has to deliver.
Right.
And by the way, as a quick parenthesis, even if there were no jobs, what would you do with your 10-year-old? Just let them play at home? You still need to scaffold a person's education at large, even if they're going to use this education for their own purpose.
Right.
For the-
This is where, my favorite footnote in the chapter that's available for free about education is that maybe folks will have to embrace more of a French work-life balance to be able in this sort of doomsday scenario, you still need to learn how to cultivate your own tastes, your own things that give you meaning, give you value in your life, even if traditional work tasks are
Yeah,
handed off to AI.
exactly. So it's really still about meaning. It's just that the meaning shifts from job centric to purpose centric, which is why you noted that in the framework, not only do we talk about knowledge, skills, character, and meta learning, but
Yes.
also talk motivation and motivation being identity, agency, and purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up because there's a really fascinating framework. We'll include links to this. It's pretty foundational to a lot of what you've been doing as a consultancy and then what you've learned through that work is this framework to kind of understand how knowledge, skills, character, meta learning, and then motivation, how these things all fit together. Can you walk us through this? Even how things relate is the thing that I like about this. It's a framework that sort of shows some of the relationships among the different things we're describing.
Well, certainly. So obviously knowledge matters. And, naive thinking says, Google knows everything. Why would you need to learn anything? That's
Hmm.
very, very naive and obsolete, lazy thinking.
Hmm.
And same deal for now, oh, the chatbot knows everything. Why would you want to learn?
Yeah, I've heard this also as the Wikipedia argument too. Like we were
Yeah.
all kind of freaked out by Wikipedia at first, but now it's a knowledge source, but that doesn't replace
Yeah.
our own.
Stop every 5 seconds and look it up.
Right.
So knowledge still matters. You just have to be more mindful of what type of knowledge matters. So you have to go and explore, what is essential knowledge? What are core concepts?
Hmm.
Those are the things that we need to refocus on and not just go about, traditional standards in various disciplines as we've known them, to be much more discerning.
Hmm.
Okay. Obviously, there's an amount of interdisciplinarity involved, etc. All right. Then you have what you do with that knowledge. That's your skill. And that
Hmm.
means creativity, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, the four C's as they're known,
Hmm.
21st century skills as they're
Yeah.
known, or
Durable skills. Yeah. Hmm.
durable skills, transversal skills, horizontal skills.
Yeah.
But above and beyond that, there's also the need to learn how to use them. And so how do you just use your knowledge, but how you behave, engage in the work?
Hmm.
And that is character.
Hmm.
So that means curiosity, ethics, and these parameters.
Yeah. Character education is an increasing trend that we've been tracking a bit on this pod as well, where like some experiments in K-12 that are trying to ground curricula in character development, even the call for civics, which, civics education, which, is getting perhaps politicized a little bit nowadays, but even the way in which it's politicized, there's still the idea that there is almost a moral function to schooling, an ethical function in that
Well,
you're
yeah,
supposed to develop citizens.
yeah. I'm glad you used the word ethical because that's far less charged than any
Yeah.
and moral,
Mhm.
morality. All these words are unfortunately tripwires.
Yeah.
Character is not. Character is accepted by virtually any culture, and it is understandable by just about everybody.
Mhm.
Within character, we have curiosity, courage, resilience, and ethics.
Mm.
And that's really what makes it up. Finally, you have meta learning, meaning metacognition, meta emotion.
Mhm.
Well, you see how it wraps around all of them because suppose you take any one of these characteristics to an extreme, right? So let's say courage. You can go from courageous to
Foolhardy?
foolhardy, exactly. Or you can be on the other side,
Cowardly, timid? Yeah, I'm an ex-Kaplan guy. I'll keep rolling the vocabulary out there.
so you have to have the right balance. And what helps you reach that balance is your metacognition, the way you think about it, the
Mhm.
way you emotionalize about it, so that you keep that right balance between one extreme and the other.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that you include both the meta emotion, not just metacognition, which is, I think, an important one because that does tie a little bit to the motivational side as well. Where one of the challenges that I've certainly seen in the mental models that are out there about AI right now is this idea of questioning human purpose, this existential threat that's out there, and it's kind of like why bother, the bots are taking over everything, and to me that speaks to the motivational context and the motivational challenges that we're facing, and that's always been a pretty fundamental educational problem. I think relevance, you were mentioning relevance is one motivator, I think, but can you talk about the motivation piece and how it ties to purpose, agency,
Certainly.
and identity?
Certainly. So just to conclude on what we're saying about meta emotion, basically meta emotion is what some would call mindfulness, but
Mhm.
without the charge that it implies related to Buddhism or any religious practice like that. It's just
Yeah.
emotionally aware and engage with others. So how does this bring us to motivation? Well, in a world where things are going to be more and more served by agents, intelligent agents and so on, you have to wonder, well, what keeps me going? Even without it being an extreme of all the jobs disappear, it can be demotivating to have agents that are quote unquote smarter in some sense.
Yep.
You. And we also suffer as a species, well, actually, most animals have an issue of power consumption due to the brain. The brain is extremely consumptive. It's 20% of the energy of the body or
Yeah.
5% of the body mass.
Yeah. And
So
Moore's
we
law,
are
unfortunately, Moore's law is not working on our brains.
correct. It's as efficient as can be with biology. I mean, far more efficient than computer chips
Yeah.
because we don't need, a nuclear power plant next to us to function.
Right.
Compared to the size of our body, it is consumptive. So the brain has learned a few tricks throughout evolution, which I call being lazy by good evolutionary design,
Yep.
meaning we tend to go on autopilot. We tend
Hmm.
to judge things fast.
Yeah.
It's the system one, system two thing
Yeah.
that
You can't
underlying
be you can't be in fight or flight perpetually. You need
exactly,
periods of recovery.
exactly. So for all of these reasons, motivation matters, it's extrinsic and intrinsic motivation for the students. And that means that can come via paying attention to their identity and belonging, their agency and growth mindset, and their purpose and passion.
Hmm.
By paying attention to all these things, now you're bringing the motivation into the Venn diagram before, saying, okay,
Yeah.
why am I doing all of this?
Right.
Because of this personalization angle that's going to
Hmm.
matter so much more.
Yeah.
So you see how we bring a lot of these concepts that people talk about as a one-off,
Yeah.
bring them all together in a cohesive ensemble that can then be actionable.
Yeah. Learner centric. We've also talked about being teacher centric. Your audience, the learner, frequently is the teacher, I would imagine, or the administrator, folks who are working in our educational system. But what I liked here is that you outlined sort of the foundation and then in service of what? Well, in service of the motivation, purpose, agency, and identity, that there's like a vector, there's a choice and a direction that is chosen to kind of apply these foundational capabilities, which I do really like. As somebody who's out there, in the field and engaging with folks, you know, any thoughts on where we are at this moment in time? As we mentioned earlier, ChatGPT, Omni is out now, and folks are certainly wondering, what's going on with that? What's going on with the evolution of this stuff? Any sense you have, particularly as it relates to education, where we are now? I imagine, there's a school year coming up in the fall. We're heading into the summer of 2024. Some of this technology is maturing, but some of it's also plateauing. Any sense of the current state of play?
Sure. Sure. So first and foremost, educators have a lot of short-term concerns that need to be addressed. What are the policies regarding student use? How do I get trained on how to use these chatbots? Fine. I think in 6 months, it will be old news by then. There's just a ramp-up phase that has to occur. But then the real work starts, and that's where very interesting tools are come online in the next couple of years. I can literally this way. We've gone from the science phase of AI, ramping up quick, to now an engineering phase
Mm,
where there are a lot of these capabilities coming together in ways that are really making it very potent. It doesn't have to be generalized intelligence to be very potent.
yeah,
And the transition from traditional machine learning, if I can call it traditional just because it's a decade old, from machine learning of last decade to now, is that these machine learning models were experts at one narrow thing, at beating you at Go or at folding proteins or discovering drugs or whatever. They were
right.
very narrow in transfer. They were experts.
Hmm.
Now, these language models are much broader. And so they can do not just expertise, but transfer as well.
Yes.
So from a very coarse perspective, you can wonder, wait a second, if these machines can do both expertise and transfer, what's left for me?
Hmm.
That's very, very crude and naive way to look at the question. I'm going to give an example about creativity.
Hmm.
People think, oh, these machines cannot create. Other people say, oh my God, these machines are going to remove all creativity. As usual, the reality is much more nuanced. And that's not what you read in the press, but that's what we have spent a lot of time in this book analyzing competency by competency, whether AI would augment or replace or substitute or whatever. So for creativity, turns out that 95% of human creativity is actually incremental. 95%.
Hmm.
Guess what? Incremental creativity means creating by analogy and by extrapolation. Well, guess what's really good at analogizing and extrapolating is
Hmm.
humans, on the other hand, are going to be still very good for imagination, unless we find a way to harness these hallucinations from the model,
Exactly. Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
But for the time being, let's say, we have a free pass on imagination.
Hmm.
However, that's where it gets complicated. For humans to come up with the next, Mozart hit or next Picasso hit or whatever, even they needed to wade through a lot of mundane things to have a spike of innovation or imagination every once in a while.
Yeah.
So if you were to delegate all your routine work to an AI, when would you be able to develop all the, acuity to come up with
Right.
an imaginary imagination laden piece at some point?
Yeah, as a parent of a 5-year-old, I call this the training wheels problem,
Yeah.
where, when he was 4, he was riding around on training wheels. He was having time of his life, but then when he turned 5, we took the training wheels off, and suddenly it's too frustrating, and he doesn't really want where, he was basically offlining his ability to balance to training wheels.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
now there's a lot of those choices that we have to make. And then it does relate also to being developmentally appropriate in our use of AI and technology as an extension. Although I'm also hearing really great stuff around the Omni side, around its assistive capabilities. The fact that it's, multimodal across modes should make it better in terms of universal design for learning and making it a little more accessible to folks who might need other affordances. Any thoughts on all that?
Let's say, first of all, it's only 24 hours old.
Right,
So
right,
we need some time to digest its true capabilities because, as usual, there's a big difference between the hype and the
for
reality.
sure. Yeah,
Remember that even Sam Altman constantly toggles back and forth about how great the new models are. Sometimes he disses them, sometimes he says,
right.
better than sliced bread, etc.
Hmm.
I reserve some time to judge. Nearly multimodality is going to be important.
Hmm.
Hallucinations are not going to go away.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, very often, a lot of these technologies are anthropomorphized by using the wrong words like emergence, reasoning.
Yep.
It should just be less human laden meaning, like
Mhm.
say thresholding rather than emergence.
Right.
And the reasoning, it's a reckoning.
It's tough though, because as someone who, does podcasts all the time, people gravitate towards the narrative elements that make the story more resonant. So
Yeah.
it is challenging to, I have a virtual co-host named Nancy who I bring on from time to time just because it's entertaining. I think it captures the imagination, but
Right.
I think we need to be more conscious around those choices. And I do appreciate your emphasis on precision around language, which I think comes from your engineering background. That was the other element that, if I'm hearing you right, if we're entering this new phase of engineering, as opposed to maybe some of the more theoretical, more pure science, hypothetical stuff that was happening, now it's out there in the field. What advice would you have for folks who are active practitioners now within education? How can they navigate some of this? You also mentioned, the importance of versatility. Your stuff on expertise versus transfer, I thought was really great. So that's another, maybe
Yeah.
an extra note or two on that might be helpful for our listeners as well.
Sure. So multiple questions in here.
Yeah.
So really we have to think about separating the what from the how in these conversations.
Mhm.
Because these are two separate audiences. The how are the teachers, the what are the curriculum designers, if not departments of education.
Yep.
And so let's start with the what, because that's part that people are not sufficiently focused on. It's a new world. Yes, we don't know what's going to come. So this image I'm going to give you is that of a Swiss Army knife. You want to have a number of blades,
Yep.
but you can always sharpen that given blade depending on the task at hand.
Right.
So if you need a better can opener, well, you develop a better can opener. But at least you have the basic tool with you.
Yeah.
So education will need to be broad and deep, which brings us to expertise and transfer.
Yeah.
rather than broad or deep. In essence, we're asking everyone to be what comes naturally to humans, but it's glorified as being for only for a few humans, Renaissance people.
Right.
Everybody is capable of more than one thing. We're not insects,
Yeah.
but it's not developed enough. And so we think that only the Da Vinci's of the world can do this sort of thing. Everybody does these things. It's just
Right.
that education has to push us forward.
Hmm.
That means that we have to modernize the traditional disciplines. First of all, why so much trigonometry, so little stats and probabilities and data science?
Right. I'm glad you didn't come after calculus, Charles, because I've been known to get defensive when people say calculus isn't as relevant anymore. Trigonometry, I will gladly jettison trigonometry. Calc, I still think is helpful. I think understanding the world as functions, not necessarily as relevant as some of the probabilistic thinking and statistical underpinnings of a lot of data modeling and data science. It's interesting when you start thinking about even the future of a math curriculum, the future of some of these sort of educational foundations. K-12 is slow, as well as anyone, K-12 is slow to change. Any thoughts on how we might be able to affect some of this change? Because it's a pretty sophisticated shift that you're kinda outlining here.
So, well, we have developed with Australia and partially with the OECD a new math curriculum.
Okay.
We we carefully, and I underline carefully, minimized or removed some of the extraneous elements,
Yeah.
like too much trigonometry. This
Yep.
is what I mean by too much. We have to use a scalpel, not a chainsaw.
Right.
So, sine, cosine, tangent, perfectly fine. We
Yeah.
love them. Keep them.
SOHCAHTOA is still in.
Yes, arc secant and so on, please.
Right.
That's not needed. So that's what I mean by being very, very careful in that choice. And so, same deal at the macro level, people use statistics and probability in their daily life, but it's terribly poorly taught, if at all,
Mhm.
particularly probability, because they're very simple from an algebraic standpoint, very
Yeah.
tough from a logical standpoint, semantic standpoint, and psychological standpoint.
Math starts to intersect with
We
behavioral
do.
science.
So that's the real world. And so that's what keeps us alive is our
Yeah.
probability. We do Bayesian probability in our head without realizing constantly as we adapt to new information.
Yeah.
But regarding calculus, I'm an engineer, I did calculus, and I have nothing against calculus. But if I have a limited amount of time, am I going to do that? Or
Right.
am I going to do discrete and computational math instead, which is really interesting,
Yeah.
important, and more data science?
Mhm.
So if I'm going to become an engineer, fine. If I'm not, these
Right.
other branches of mathematics matter a lot more
Right.
for the overall population.
It's interesting where there's almost like agent facing competencies versus human facing ones. And then there's probably some overlap where the ability to write or communicate your ideas effectively, that's great in human facing social, professional engagements. But it's also helpful when engaging with a large language model. Same thing for creativity. Like some of these durable skills, I imagine they work in both contexts. But then there's also, new hard skills that are emerging around engaging with artificial intelligence. Do you have any sense of what that is? Like what types of skills or competencies, who works best with AI, or advice for people if they want to get better at engaging with some
Well,
of these new capabilities?
so amusingly, of course, language models require you to master language better, to figure out, but they also force you to become better at computational thinking. In
Mm,
other words, to be really clear about your thought process, because these things are not Aladdin's lamp. You
right,
cannot just say, Genie, give me this.
right,
But the genie will actually answer you, what exactly do you mean by this?
right.
So you have to really carefully compose your thoughts. And that's much tougher than people realize. But it's a great way to learn coding without code.
Right.
It's literally computational thinking without having to go through the abstraction of
Mm,
a computer language.
mhm, right.
So that is absolutely needed. And I don't see a way this would ever go away because I don't see a machine divining your thoughts.
Right. Right.
So no matter what, if you want to use these engines, you're going to have to be really careful, know their limitations, know what you can ask, know how you can ask, and accept that it's going to be diminishing returns past a few questions down. they're not all capable.
Right.
So they can short circuit some of the tedium,
Hmm.
help you with some of the early thinking,
Hmm.
and then you have to come in.
Right. Yeah. And I've heard also folks talk about the importance of problem formulation in this day
Exactly.
and age where, getting back to your framework, it's almost like the vector, the direction that we're going to want to apply these capabilities to. What do we want to point the AIs at? To some extent, that's really what, prompt engineering is. You're trying to get it pointed at the right problem, understand the capabilities, and then define the parameters to get the right outputs. Any thoughts on that? Because it does seem like that may become the more foundational problem for humans is what problems are we leveraging these new capabilities to solve?
Right. That takes us right back to
Mhm.
purpose and passion, right? Whether or not the jobs all disappear, we're still back to purpose as a motivator for students, for everybody, for humans at large. And so that's what needs to be paid attention to. Now, we all have different motivations. What we don't understand very well and what ourselves typically is that our motivations are multifaceted. You don't have one thing that drives you. You have a constellation of things, a bit like a diamond with its facets,
Right.
and they come in and out depending on the circumstance.
Mhm.
And that's number one. Number two, we always think it should all be intrinsic motivation. Sorry, but sometimes the fear of a bad grade
Also
or
just the fear of, paying rent.
also a real life motivator. So
Right.
I don't want to go too far with it. So to the point
Mhm.
of paralysis, but hey, whatever works. So now in that sense of purpose, you're going to decide, okay, well, for me, a sense of purpose is to design I don't know, a marine robot that's going to count plastic particles in the ocean. But yours could be something completely different. You
Right.
want to desalinate water, to out the Sahara Desert.
Right. Right. Or make a really, really good guacamole. It all depends,
Oh, guacamole, exactly.
you know?
And so that's where AI will help. But it's not a genie. It's a tool. So
And
you
then
want
and then
to know what questions to ask to figure out how to use it.
Yeah, and then that's where I think the engineering mindset is an important one as well that you're putting out there where, you get whatever information back from the large language model, the agent that you're working with, but then can you apply that in a way that actually is making an impact? And do you have skills that are directly relevant to being able to make an impact? I'm talking to Charles Fadel, who is the founder of the Center for Curriculum Redesign. He's also the author of Education for the Age of AI. It's been an amazing conversation, Charles. Clearly, there's plenty to chew on, both in your book and in all the topics that we're hitting on today. If folks are getting ready to head back to the rest of their lives, do you have other ideas, other concepts, other things you want to put out there?
Yes, really, it's a question of paying attention to both the what and the how as we move forward. There are plenty of uses that are going to emerge for the classroom, all sorts of different tools that are going to come up. It's going to be a question of integration at some point because there are going to be too many tools all over the place. EdTech has failed repeatedly to deliver on its promise,
Right.
but also because we overpromise and overexpect. We always expect the silver bullet that is going to solve all of education's
Mm,
problems
yeah.
and saying, well, we have a number of different tools to
Mm,
be applied wisely.
yeah. I love that. Erin Moat, I just heard talking about this, and she was talking about the importance of data interoperability, cybersecurity, and really kind of the pipes, the infrastructure that is ultimately providing the data that the AIs are trained on. There's a lot of technical debt and a lot of inoperability, segmented, siloed data sets out there. And some of the real work is going to be kind of under the hood, cleaning things up, getting the plumbing working so that we can all get the returns that we want. Final thoughts, Charles, as we close here?
Final thoughts. A fascinating moment in humankind, rendered all the more urgent by the problems that humans have uniquely created for themselves.
Yeah. So hopefully it's just in time technology, perhaps. There is some positive framing that we could have in the future scenarios. It's not all dystopic sci fi, although there is a certain human tendency to gravitate to that. Charles Fidel, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
My pleasure, Mike.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please subscribe, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.